most youth are really happy to be back in school. I think after 3 years of back and forth on doing virtual learning, I think for the most part, just people were tired and they were ready to get back to, their regular activities and doing extracurricular activities and socializing with their friends. And then we have another group of youth who are really struggling with returning to being in person and being just having that face-to-face interactions. Some youth really found comfort with being at home and, that security of being behind a computer and just in their own rooms. And it's now that, things are back in person, they're having a hard time.
Yeah, expand on that. Why does the virtual learning sort of add a layer of security?
So we're seeing youth who were, for the most part, already having a hard time before the pandemic in social settings. So whether they were being bullied or whether they were already having anxiety or, having depression, being at home gave them that extra layer of comfort and security where they didn't have to put on their cameras if they didn't want to. They could be in their comfort of their own room. If they were distracted or bored, sometimes just kind of go online and look up something else. We saw a lot of that. And so having that being taken away and having to return back to a place where they didn't necessarily feel safe we see that it's creating more challenges.
What are some of those challenges? I could imagine anxiety is higher. What are some of the other symptoms or diagnoses that you're seeing?
So we're seeing a lot of depression as well. As you said, anxiety is the main one that we're seeing a lot of. We see youth who are also struggling with eating as well, and like disordered eating. We saw an increase in eating disorders during the pandemic as well, where we had youth spending a lot of time online and doing a lot of comparisons and comparing themselves to, people who seem to be living their best lives. And so we did see an increase in that. Just to kind of give you some statistics, there was a survey that was done in 2020, and we saw that 70% of 6 to 18-year-olds in Ontario actually had their mental health worsen during the first wave of the pandemic. And on the other end of that, 20% of the same age group had their mental health improve during the first wave.
I'm in the 20, I think. Were you surprised by 70%?
Yes, yeah. That 70% is very high to see. But when we look at like that being an unprecedented time where even we're looking at adults and the, how adults were affected by the pandemic and how their mental health was affected as well. There was so much uncertainty.
That's what I was wondering. I mean, yeah, part of it is sort of protection away from the world, but then there's also you're away from the information. And I'm wondering as a teenager how my brain would have processed really what's going on. Now I'm wearing a mask. I'm told so-and-so died from this.
Yeah.
And I know during the pandemic, you try and have those stories, but you also get to a point where there's a burnout. You don't want to hear anymore about what's going on. You just want to know how much longer is this going to happen.
Exactly.
Are we seeing that with the teens? How is that information sort of being presented? Is there confusion? You're nodding a lot. I think I might be onto something.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Amy. This was the first time where it seemed like the entire world was shut down. Mm-hmm. And we almost had no choice but to be face to face with what was going on all around the world, whether it be the news or social media. During that time, during the pandemic was also, a time where we had, George Floyd and a lot of these really impactful world issues that happened, and we had no choice but to be forced to watch, a lot of these atrocities happen as well. And so that, I believe, had a huge impact on the mental health of a lot of youth, especially, racialized youth, especially the Black youth, and we saw different things. So there's no doubt that youth were left in a state of confusion or anger or just so much uncertainty.
What kind of long-term effects does that have?
Well, we see, youth, or a lot of the youth who were struggled with anxiety, They're still, we see a lot of youth who are still struggling with just everyday life. Being in school can be really challenging. We see the depression rates as well increase. Just their ability to cope on an everyday can be very challenging. We're still seeing youth, who choose to wear masks because some have a fear of getting COVID, and others, they just found security in being hidden. So, especially children who were bullied for their appearance for any reason, the mask is now a way to kind of protect themselves too.
That surprises me. Did that surprise you at all? I mean, this is the world you live in. Not much surprises you anymore, but
That is true. Although, there's always something. There's always something that can be surprising. It is, you really feel for these youth, and you really just have that compassion for them, and working through. There's so many different issues that you can imagine as an adolescent going through so many changes and peers and bullying, and now this adds another layer.
something you and I were talking about earlier that I think would be of value to the listeners was when you talked about how these teenagers are creating their own reality online. And now they're sort of living with the aftermath of that. Can you explain that for us again?
Yes. So we noticed during the pandemic there were quite a few youth who, you're in front of a computer for all day for the most part. And so we saw an increase in addictions to screens and social media and different online platforms. There are a significant amount of youth who had the ability to create their own virtual realities. When you're behind a screen, nobody really knows who you are. You can really get into this entire fantasy world. A lot of youth engaged in a lot of online platforms with youth all over the world, and their friends and their support groups really became these online communities.
Well, TikTok, it started during the pandemic and
It did,
took
yeah.
off. Is that sort of the world we're talking about, or is there something beyond that, like a gaming?
Yeah, so there's TikTok, and there's also there's a more social component as well, where there are online chat groups, or there's these online platforms where communities are actually developing friendships, relationships. The same drama that you would have in person is now happening online. And so now youth have to move back to being in person. It can really have them question their sense of identity. Who are they now? They created an identity online, and now it's being faced with, well, who am I outside of that?
Looking back, I know hindsight is 2020, but how could we have done better as a community to support youth during the pandemic?
That's a really great question. We saw during the pandemic there were youth who knew they needed mental health services, but didn't necessarily know how to access it, or they felt afraid, or there was a sense of stigma in accessing mental health services. I think as a community, really focusing on eradicating that stigma, reducing that stigma, so that youth, would access mental health services as they would a dentist or, a doctor, and not think twice about recognizing, I'm not feeling right. I need to talk to somebody. I think that would be my first suggestion. Just making mental health and mental wellness just a part of everyday life and in all platforms. And I think in the schools as well, just really providing more support for youth, especially when things were locked down, really having avenues and opportunities for youth to engage with each other socially in a healthy way.
Great. Thanks so much for coming in today. I appreciate you taking
You're
the effort.
very